The message came through at 11:47 p.m. on a Tuesday. "You're just like your crazy mother, maybe you should have gone with her." My Aunt Patricia had sent it to our family group chat, and within minutes 3 people had reacted with heart emojis. My cousin Jake even replied with "finally someone said it." I stared at my phone screen until the words blurred, my hands shaking so badly I nearly dropped it. That was the moment I knew I had to play the recording, the one I'd kept hidden for 8 years. The one that would change everything they thought they knew about my mother, about me, and about the lies this family had built their entire identity around. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. I should probably start from the beginning, shouldn't I? My name is Sarah, and I'm 32 years old. I work as a librarian in Portland, Oregon, though I grew up in a small town called Millbrook, about 2 hours south. I've always been what people call the quiet one, the observer, the one who notices things others miss. Maybe that's because I learned early that in my family, paying attention could mean the difference between peace and chaos. My mother, Rebecca, died when I was 24. She'd been battling severe depression and anxiety for most of my childhood, and the family had spent years treating her like she was broken, unstable, embarrassing. They whispered about her episodes, rolled their eyes when she couldn't make it to family gatherings, and eventually, they just stopped inviting her altogether. But here's what they never knew, what none of them ever bothered to learn. My mother wasn't just struggling with mental illness in a vacuum, she was drowning under the weight of family secrets that would have crushed anyone. And I was the only one who knew the truth because I was the only one who actually listened to her, really listened, when she tried to tell us what was happening behind closed doors. The family dynamics in our house were complicated from the start. My father, David, was the golden child in his family. Aunt Patricia was his older sister, and she'd appointed herself as the unofficial head of the family after their parents died. She was married to Uncle Robert, a man who owned 3 successful hardware stores, and never let anyone forget it. They lived in the biggest house, threw the most elaborate Christmas parties, and somehow, everyone deferred to Patricia's judgment about everything, including what was wrong with my mother. Patricia had this way of speaking about my mom like she was a case study rather than a human being. "Rebecca's having one of her episodes again," she'd say with this clinical detachment that made my skin crawl. Or "we need to be patient with Rebecca, you know how she gets." The worst part was how everyone nodded along, like they were all experts in mental health, because Patricia had decided that's what the problem was. They never questioned it, they never dug deeper. They just accepted that my mother was the broken one, the problem, the person who needed to be managed rather than supported. What they didn't know was that my mother had tried to tell them, multiple times, about Uncle Robert's late-night visits when she was 16, about the money that went missing from her college fund, that somehow ended up paying for Patricia's wedding, about the way Robert had cornered her at family gatherings for years, making comments about how she'd grown up pretty and how she should come visit the store sometime when Patricia wasn't around. She'd tried to speak up, tried to get someone, anyone, to listen, but Patricia had shut it down every time. "Rebecca, you're imagining things. Robert would never, you're just looking for attention." That's what Patricia would say, and because Patricia was older, more established, more convincing, everyone believed her. They convinced my mother that her memories were unreliable, that her discomfort was paranoia, that her fear was just another symptom of her instability. They gaslit her so thoroughly that she started doubting her own experiences, started thinking maybe she was crazy after all. I was 12 when I first heard my mother crying in her bedroom at 3 in the morning. I'd gotten up to get a glass of water and heard these muffled sobs coming from down the hall. When I peeked through the crack in her door, she was on the floor of her closet, clutching her phone. She was leaving a voicemail for Patricia, begging her to please just listen, please just believe her this one time, about what Robert had done at the family barbecue that afternoon. I stood there frozen, listening to my mother pour her heart out to someone who had already decided she was lying. The next morning at breakfast, Patricia called. I could only hear my mother's side of the conversation, but it was enough. "I know what I saw, Patricia. I know what he said to me." Long pause. "No, I'm not having an episode. I'm telling you the truth." Another pause. Longer this time. "Please don't do that. Please don't tell everyone I'm having problems again." But Patricia had already made up her mind. Within hours, the phone was ringing off the hook. Concerned relatives wanting to know if mom was okay, if she needed to talk to someone, if maybe she should consider getting some help. That was the pattern that would define the next 12 years of my mother's life. She'd try to speak her truth, Patricia would discredit her, and the family would rally around the narrative that mom was unstable, unreliable, someone whose perceptions couldn't be trusted. It was like watching someone slowly disappear, not through death, but through the systematic erasure of their right to be believed. I became my mother's ally, though I didn't fully understand what I was allied with at the time. I just knew that the woman they described as crazy, dramatic attention-seeking didn't match the woman who helped me with homework every night, who remembered every detail of my day when I came home from school, who noticed when I was sad or worried and would sit with me until I felt better. The woman who made the most incredible chocolate chip cookies from scratch, and who could quote entire passages from Jane Austen novels, because she'd read them so many times. That woman wasn't crazy. That woman was drowning. The breaking point came during my sophomore year of high school. It was Patricia's annual Christmas party, the one where everyone was expected to show up and play happy family. My mother had been having a particularly difficult few months. She'd started therapy, which everyone took as confirmation that she was finally getting the help she needed, but what they didn't understand was that therapy was actually helping her process the trauma they all insisted didn't exist. She was getting stronger, more clear about what had happened to her, more determined to speak up. That night at the party, Uncle Robert had been drinking, more than usual, and when my mother went to the kitchen to help with dessert, he followed her. I was 17, old enough to understand the look of terror that crossed my mother's face when she saw him in the doorway, old enough to understand why she backed against the counter like a trapped animal, and definitely old enough to understand what he meant when he cornered her and said, "You've been telling stories again, haven't you, Rebecca? You know what happens to little girls who tell stories." I watched my mother break down right there in Patricia's kitchen. Not the kind of breakdown everyone expected from her, the kind they could dismiss as another episode. This was different. This was raw primal fear mixed with years of suppressed rage. She started yelling at him, telling him to stay away from her, to never touch her again, to stop pretending he was a good man when everyone in the family knew better. She was loud enough that people started gathering in the kitchen doorway, watching the spectacle unfold. Robert, of course, played his part perfectly. He stepped back with his hands up, looking shocked and hurt. "Rebecca, what's gotten into you?" "I was just trying to help with the dishes." His performance was Oscar-worthy, the confused, innocent man being attacked by his unstable sister-in-law. Patricia rushed to his side immediately, putting her arm around him protectively while staring at my mother with disgust. "That's enough," Patricia announced to the room. "Rebecca, you need to calm down. You're frightening the children." She looked directly at me when she said it, like I was some fragile thing that needed protecting from my own mother's episode. But I wasn't frightened of my mother. I was frightened for her, because I could see what was happening. I could see how Robert's calculated innocence was playing against my mother's desperate truth-telling, and I knew who the family would believe. The aftermath was swift and brutal. Within a week, every member of our extended family had called to express their concern about Mom's violent outburst at the Christmas party. Patricia had already crafted the narrative. Rebecca had attacked poor Robert out of nowhere, screaming paranoid accusations that made no sense. She was clearly having a severe mental health crisis and needed intervention. Maybe it was time to consider inpatient treatment. Maybe she wasn't safe around me. Maybe Dad needed to think about what was best for everyone involved. I watched my father crumble under the pressure. He'd been dealing with Mom's struggles for years, and he was exhausted. When his entire family started telling him that his wife was dangerous, that she was getting worse, that something needed to be done, he started believing them. Not because he wanted to, but because it was easier than standing against the tide. Because questioning Patricia meant questioning everything, and he didn't have the strength for that kind of fight. The next few months were a nightmare. Mom was put on stronger medications that made her foggy and disconnected. She stopped trying to defend herself, because every time she spoke up, it was used as evidence of her deteriorating condition. She became a shell of herself, shuffling through the house like she was apologizing for existing. The vibrant woman who had raised me was disappearing, replaced by someone who whispered when she spoke, and flinched when anyone raised their voice. I tried to be her advocate, but I was just a teenager. When I told Dad that Mom wasn't crazy, that Uncle Robert had really threatened her, he looked at me with such pity, it made my stomach turn. Honey, I know you love your mother, but you have to understand that sometimes, people we love get sick in ways that make them see things that aren't there. He'd bought into Patricia's version so completely that he couldn't even consider the possibility that his own wife was telling the truth about her own experiences. The isolation was the worst part. Patricia had effectively excommunicated Mom from the family while still requiring her to show up to events. It was a special kind of cruelty. Mom would sit at family dinners like a ghost, ignored by everyone except when they needed to make a show of being patient with her illness. They'd speak about her in third person while she was sitting right there. How is Rebecca doing with her new medication? Have you noticed any improvement in Rebecca's mood? As if she couldn't speak for herself, as if she'd lost the right to participate in conversations about her own life. I started recording things, not intentionally at first, but I had gotten a small digital recorder for a journalism class, and I found myself carrying it everywhere. Maybe it was some unconscious need to document what was really happening, to have proof that the version of events everyone accepted wasn't the whole truth. I recorded Patricia's phone calls with other family members where she'd discuss Mom's condition with clinical detachment. I recorded Uncle Robert making inappropriate comments when he thought no one was listening. I recorded my mother's quiet moments of clarity when she'd try to explain to me what really happened, why she was so afraid, why no one would believe her. The recordings became my secret obsession. I had hours of audio that painted a completely different picture of our family dynamics than the one everyone wanted to maintain. I had Patricia laughing about how easy it was to convince everyone that Rebecca was losing it. I had Robert making jokes about crazy Rebecca and her wild imagination. I had family members who claimed to care about Mom's well-being discussing her like she was a problem to be managed rather than a person to be supported. But the most important recording came later. Much later, after Mom had been diagnosed with severe depression and anxiety, after she'd been hospitalized twice, after everyone had settled into the comfortable narrative that she was mentally ill and needed to be handled with kid gloves.
Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story.
It was the recording that would change everything. The one that would prove beyond doubt that my mother wasn't crazy, wasn't paranoid, wasn't making things up. But I wouldn't discover its true significance until after her funeral, wouldn't understand its power until Aunt Patricia pushed me too far, and I finally found the courage to use it. By the time I graduated high school, the family had established a routine around Mom's condition. Patricia had appointed herself as the unofficial case manager, deciding what Mom could handle and what would be too much stress for her. Dad had become Patricia's lieutenant, enforcing the boundaries she set without question, and I had become the bridge between Mom and the rest of the world, translating her needs and defending her choices to people who had already decided she was incapable of making good decisions. College was supposed to be my escape, but leaving Mom alone with Dad and Patricia's management system felt like abandonment. I chose a school only an hour away so I could come home on weekends and make sure she was okay. Every Friday, I'd drive back to Millbrook with a knot in my stomach, wondering what new indignity the family had subjected her to in my absence. Every Sunday, I'd leave feeling like I was deserting her all over again. During my junior year, Mom had what everyone called her worst episode yet. She'd been having nightmares about Uncle Robert, vivid dreams where he was chasing her through the house, cornering her in rooms with no exits. She'd wake up screaming, and when Dad tried to comfort her, she'd push him away, sobbing that no one believed her, that no one would ever believe her. Patricia decided this was clear evidence that Mom needed more intensive treatment, maybe a longer hospitalization, maybe a different approach altogether. That's when I realized I couldn't just be a passive observer anymore. I was 20 years old enough to have opinions, old enough to ask questions, old enough to demand answers. I started pushing back against Patricia's narratives, asking why Mom's fears were automatically dismissed as delusions, why no one had ever investigated her claims about Robert, why the family was so quick to label her as unstable rather than address the possibility that someone had actually hurt her. Patricia did not appreciate my questions. She started treating me like I was infected with Mom's paranoia, like I was too young and impressionable to understand the complexity of mental illness. She'd pat my hand condescendingly and say things like, "I know it's hard to accept when someone you love is sick, but denial isn't going to help your mother get better." She made me feel like questioning the family's version of events was somehow cruel to Mom, like I was making things worse by refusing to accept that she was mentally ill. But I kept questioning, and I kept recording. And slowly I started to piece together a different version of our family's history, a version where Mom wasn't the problem but the victim, where her episodes were actually trauma responses to ongoing abuse and gaslighting, where her paranoia was actually hypervigilance developed as a survival mechanism, where her instability was actually the natural result of being systematically discredited and isolated by the people who were supposed to protect her. The revelation came during Mom's second hospitalization. When I was 21, she'd been admitted after what the family called a complete breakdown, but what I recognized as a desperate attempt to get anyone to listen to her story. She'd gone to Patricia's house unannounced and confronted her about covering up Robert's abuse. She'd demanded that Patricia tell the truth, that she admit she'd known all along what Robert was doing and had chosen to protect him instead of her own sister-in-law. The conversation had escalated until neighbors called the police, concerned about the disturbed woman screaming on Patricia's front porch. I was the only one who visited Mom regularly during her 2-week stay at the psychiatric facility. Dad came once, but he spent the entire time talking to her doctors about medication adjustments and treatment plans. Patricia sent flowers with a card that said "Get well soon," like Mom had the flu. The rest of the family maintained a respectful distance, waiting for the latest crisis to pass so they could go back to managing her from afar. During one of my visits, Mom grabbed my hand with a strength that surprised me. Her eyes were clearer than they'd been in months, and she spoke with an urgency I hadn't heard from her in years. "Sarah, I need you to understand something. Everything they've told you about me, about my problems, about my episodes, it's not the whole truth. I'm not crazy. I'm not paranoid. I'm not making things up, but I'm running out of time to make anyone believe me." She told me about a conversation she'd had with Patricia years earlier before I was born. Patricia had confessed that she knew about Robert's behavior, that she'd always known, but she'd made a choice to protect her marriage and her family's reputation rather than protect Mom. She'd told Mom that if she ever spoke up about what Robert had done, Patricia would make sure everyone knew she was unstable, unreliable, someone whose word couldn't be trusted. It was a threat and a promise, and Patricia had spent the next 20 years making good on it. "I recorded it," Mom whispered, squeezing my hand tighter. "The conversation with Patricia. I had that little recorder you gave me for my birthday, the one you said would help me remember things better. I recorded the whole thing." She admitted everything, Sarah. She admitted that she knew what Robert did to me, and she admitted that she'd been lying to the family about my mental health to keep me quiet. My heart stopped. Mom had evidence, actual undeniable proof, that Patricia had been orchestrating a years-long campaign to discredit her. Proof that the family's understanding of Mom's mental health was built on lies. Proof that Mom had been telling the truth all along. "Where is it?" I asked, trying to keep my voice steady. "Where's the recording?" Mom's expression crumbled. "I hid it. In my jewelry box, in the secret compartment your father doesn't know about. But Sarah, I'm scared. I'm scared of what will happen if I use it. I'm scared of what Patricia will do if she knows I have proof. I'm scared that even with evidence, no one will believe me because they've all decided I'm crazy." I promised her I'd find the recording. I promised her I'd listen to it. And I promised her that if it contained what she said it did, I'd make sure the truth came out. But I also told her to wait, to not do anything drastic while she was in the hospital, while she was vulnerable and medicated and surrounded by people who already doubted her credibility. I told her we'd figure out the right time and the right way to reveal what Patricia had done. It was the last real conversation we ever had. Mom was released from the hospital with a new medication regimen that made her even more withdrawn than before. She stopped trying to defend herself, stopped trying to make anyone listen, stopped fighting for her own truth. She became compliant in a way that broke my heart because I knew it wasn't peace. It was defeat. The recording stayed hidden in her jewelry box for 2 more years. 2 years during which I finished college, started graduate school, and watched my mother fade away like a photograph left in the sun. She stopped participating in family gatherings entirely. She stopped trying to have relationships with anyone except me and Dad. She became a ghost in her own life, haunting the edges of family events, acknowledged but not included, tolerated but not welcomed. When Mom died, it wasn't dramatic. It wasn't sudden. It was the quiet ending of someone who had been disappearing for years. She went to sleep one night and didn't wake up. The doctors said it was heart failure, but I knew better. It was the kind of dying that happens when you've been convinced you don't deserve to live, when you've been told so many times that your truth doesn't matter that you start believing it. The funeral was everything Mom would have hated. Patricia orchestrated the entire thing, turning it into a performance of family grief rather than a genuine celebration of Mom's life. She gave a eulogy that painted Mom as a beloved family member who had struggled with mental illness but was finally at peace. She spoke about the importance of supporting family members with mental health challenges, about the grace required to love someone whose reality was sometimes different from everyone else's. I sat in the front pew, listening to Patricia rewrite my mother's story one final time, and I felt something inside me harden into resolve. After the service, after the burial, after all the casseroles and condolences and empty promises to stay in touch, I went to Mom's house and found her jewelry box. In the secret compartment she'd told me about, wrapped in tissue paper like a precious artifact, was a small digital recorder. I took it home and listened to it alone in my apartment. What I heard changed everything I thought I knew about the power of truth, about the lengths people will go to protect their own interests, and about the courage it would eventually take to honor my mother's memory by making sure her voice was finally heard. The recording was exactly what Mom had said it was. 43 minutes of Patricia admitting that she'd known about Robert's abuse, that she'd chosen to protect him instead of Mom, and that she'd systematically turned the family against Mom to ensure her silence. It was Patricia's voice, clear and unmistakable, laying out the blueprint for 8 years of psychological warfare designed to make Mom doubt her own sanity. But I wasn't ready to use it yet. I was too raw, too grief-stricken, too afraid of what would happen if I detonated that bomb in the middle of our family's carefully constructed mythology. So I kept it safe, kept it secret, and tried to move on with my life while carrying the weight of Mom's vindication in my pocket like a talisman. For 8 years I carried that recording. Through graduate school, through my first job, through relationships and breakups and all the ordinary milestones of adult life. I carried it through family gatherings where Patricia continued to speak about Mom with condescending pity, through conversations where relatives would ask how I was processing my mother's mental illness, through moments when I wanted to scream that they had it all wrong but didn't have the courage to speak up. And then came that Tuesday night message. "You're just like your crazy mother, maybe you should have gone with her." Patricia had finally pushed too far, finally said the thing that made it impossible for me to stay silent. Because in insulting me, she had insulted Mom's memory one last time, and this time, I had the power to fight back. This time, I had the recording. The next morning, I called in sick to work. I couldn't focus on cataloging books and helping patrons find romance novels when my entire world had shifted overnight. Patricia's message kept replaying in my head like a broken record, each word cutting deeper than the last. "You're just like your crazy mother. Maybe you should have gone with her." The casual cruelty of it, the way she'd weaponized my grief, the assumption that she could say anything she wanted because who was going to stop her? I sat at my kitchen table with the digital recorder in front of me, the same one that had been hidden in Mom's jewelry box for 8 years. I'd listened to the recording countless times over the years, but never with the intention of actually using it. It had been my secret comfort, my private proof that Mom hadn't been crazy, that everything she'd told me was true. But now it felt different. Now it felt like a weapon I was finally ready to wield. The recording quality was surprisingly clear for something that was over a decade old. Mom's voice came through first, nervous but determined. "Patricia, I need to talk to you about something serious. About Robert and what happened when I was 16. There was a pause, then Patricia's voice, already annoyed. "Rebecca, we've been through this. You're remembering things wrong again." But Mom pressed on. "No, I'm not. And I think you know I'm not. I think you've always known what your husband did to me, and you chose to protect him instead of protecting me. The silence that followed was long enough that I'd initially thought the recording had stopped. Then Patricia's voice came back, different now, colder, more calculated. Fine, you want to have this conversation, let's have it. Yes, I knew. Of course I knew. Robert told me everything after it happened. He was drunk. He made a mistake. He felt terrible about it.
But Rebecca, you were 16, and you were flirting with him all night. You can't tell me you didn't know what you were doing. Even though I'd heard it dozens of times, Patricia's words still made my stomach turn. The way she'd blamed Mom for her own assault, the way she'd minimized Robert's actions as a mistake, the casual admission that she'd known all along and had chosen to cover it up. But it got worse. Mom's voice on the recording was shaking now. Patricia, he didn't just touch me inappropriately. He raped me, in your guest bedroom while you were downstairs hosting your book club. And when I tried to tell you the next day, you said I was lying, that I was attention-seeking, that I needed to stop making up stories. Patricia's response was swift and brutal, because you were lying, Rebecca. Or at least you were exaggerating. Robert said you were a willing participant until you regretted it later. And honestly, with your history of drama and emotional problems, who was I supposed to believe? My husband or my hysterical sister-in-law, who's always been jealous of what Robert and I have? The gaslighting in Patricia's voice was masterful. The way she'd turned Mom's trauma into jealousy, her truth into hysteria, her pain into attention-seeking behavior. But Mom hadn't given up. She'd kept pushing, kept demanding acknowledgement, kept insisting on the truth. I was a child, Patricia. I was 16 years old, and I was a virgin, and your husband raped me in your house while you were downstairs. And instead of protecting me, instead of getting me help, instead of holding him accountable, you decided to protect your marriage by destroying my credibility. You've spent the last 8 years convincing everyone I'm mentally unstable, so that if I ever tried to tell the truth about Robert, no one would believe me. That's when Patricia's mask had completely slipped. Her voice on the recording became venomous, calculated, terrifying in its honesty. You're right, that's exactly what I did. Because Rebecca, my marriage is worth more to me than your feelings. My family's reputation is worth more to me than your need for justice. And your word against his. Please, I've made sure that your word doesn't count for anything anymore. The recording continued for another 30 minutes, with Patricia laying out her strategy in chilling detail. How she'd started planting seeds about Mom's emotional instability immediately after the assault. How she'd encouraged family members to see Mom's trauma responses as mental illness. How she'd carefully documented every time Mom seemed upset or overwhelmed, creating a paper trail of concerning behavior that she could point to if Mom ever tried to come forward. Patricia had admitted to coaching Robert on how to respond if Mom ever accused him publicly. She'd admitted to spreading rumors about Mom's mental health to neighbors, friends, even Mom's employers. She'd admitted to convincing Dad that Mom needed professional help, not because she was concerned about Mom's well-being, but because having Mom in therapy made her seem less credible if she ever tried to report what Robert had done. The most damning part came near the end, when Mom had asked Patricia directly why she'd chosen to protect a rapist instead of supporting a victim. Patricia's answer was delivered with the casual cruelty of someone who'd never questioned her own choices. Because Robert is useful to me, Rebecca. He makes good money, he's well respected in the community, and he keeps me comfortable. You, on the other hand, have never been anything but a burden to this family. Even before this happened, you were always too sensitive, too emotional, too needy. This just gave me a reason to do what I'd wanted to do anyway, which was minimize your influence on our family dynamics. Patricia had then laid out her long-term plan with the precision of a military strategist. She would continue to undermine Mom's credibility at every opportunity. She would frame Mom's legitimate grievances as symptoms of mental illness. She would rally the family around the narrative that Mom was unstable and needed management rather than support. And if Mom ever tried to go public with her accusations, Patricia would have years of documented erratic behavior to point to as evidence that Mom was delusional. The beauty of it, Patricia had said on the recording, is that the more you try to tell the truth, the crazier you'll seem. Because I've already convinced everyone that you can't be trusted. So go ahead, Rebecca. Tell your story, see who believes you. Listening to it again, after Patricia's cruel message the night before, I felt something shift inside me. For 8 years, I'd been complicit in Patricia's cover-up simply by staying silent. I'd watched her give eulogies about mental health awareness at Mom's funeral, while knowing she'd been the architect of Mom's psychological destruction. I'd listened to family members speak about Mom's struggles with compassionate concern, while knowing they'd been manipulated into that position by someone who'd wanted to destroy her credibility. But Patricia's message had changed the equation. By attacking me directly, by suggesting I should have died with my mother, she'd crossed a line that made silence impossible. She'd made it personal in a way that demanded a response. And for the first time in 8 years, I felt ready to give her one. I spent the morning transcribing the recording word for word. 43 minutes of audio became 12 pages of typed text, each sentence more damning than the last. I created multiple backup copies, saved them to cloud storage, emailed them to myself from 3 different accounts. I wasn't going to let this evidence disappear the way Mom's voice had been silenced. Then I started making a plan. I couldn't just send the recording to the family group chat and hope for the best. Patricia had spent over a decade crafting her narrative about Mom's mental health, and she wouldn't go down without a fight. She'd probably claim the recording was fake, or taken out of context, or evidence of Mom's deteriorating grip on reality. I needed to be strategic about how I presented this information if I wanted it to have maximum impact. I decided to start with my father. If anyone deserved to know the truth about what had happened to his wife, it was him. Dad had spent years believing he was supporting a mentally ill woman through her struggles, never knowing that those struggles were the direct result of trauma and systematic gaslighting. He'd been as much a victim of Patricia's manipulation as Mom had been, just in a different way. I called him that afternoon and asked if I could come over. There was something important about Mom that I needed to share with him, something I'd discovered while going through her things. Dad sounded tired when he agreed to see me, but not surprised. He'd probably been expecting me to have some kind of breakdown eventually. After all, according to family lore, mental instability ran in my bloodline. When I arrived at Dad's house, the house where I'd grown up, where Mom had spent her last years as a ghost of herself, I felt a familiar sadness settle over me. Nothing had changed since Mom died. Her coffee mug was still in the cabinet, her gardening gloves still on the back porch, her bookmark still holding her place in a novel she'd never finish. Dad had preserved everything like a shrine to guilt, as if keeping her possessions exactly where she'd left them could somehow make up for the years he'd failed to really see her. We sat in the living room where I'd done homework while Mom made dinner, where we'd watched old movies together on Sunday afternoons, where Mom had tried so many times to explain to Dad what was really happening to her, while he nodded sympathetically and suggested she talk to her therapist about it. The irony of the setting wasn't lost on me. "Dad," I said, pulling out the transcript I'd prepared, "I need you to listen to something, and I need you to promise me you'll listen to the whole thing before you say anything or make any judgments about what you're hearing." He looked confused but nodded. I pressed play on the digital recorder and watched his face as Patricia's voice filled the room, admitting to 8 years of psychological warfare designed to discredit his wife. I watched him realize that every therapy session, every medication adjustment, every conversation about Mom's mental health had been built on a foundation of lies designed to protect a rapist and silence his victim. The transformation on Dad's face was heartbreaking. Confusion gave way to horror, horror gave way to understanding, and understanding gave way to a grief so profound it seemed to age him in real time. When the recording ended, he sat in silence for what felt like hours, staring at the digital recorder like it was a bomb that had just detonated in his living room. "She knew," he finally whispered. "Rebecca knew all along that no one would believe her. And I didn't believe her either." I handed him the transcript, watching as he read Patricia's words in black and white, seeing the evidence of his sister's cruelty laid out in undeniable detail. His hands were shaking by the time he finished reading, and when he looked up at me, his eyes were filled with a pain I'd never seen before. "Sarah, what do we do with this? How do we—" He gestured helplessly at the transcript. "How do we fix this? How do we make this right?" That's when I told him about Patricia's message from the night before. About how she'd told me I was just like my crazy mother, how she'd suggested I should have died with her. I showed him the screenshots I'd taken, the heart emoji reactions from other family members, the casual cruelty of people who thought they were on the right side of family dynamics. Dad's face went through another transformation then. The grief was still there, but it was joined by something else. Anger. The kind of deep, righteous anger that comes from realizing you've been systematically deceived by people you trusted, that your wife died believing she was crazy when she was actually the only sane person in the room. "We're going to play this for everyone," he said, his voice steady for the first time since I'd arrived. "We're going to make sure every single person in this family knows what Patricia did to your mother, and then we're going to make sure she faces consequences for it." But I had a different idea. Playing the recording for the family would certainly expose Patricia's lies, but it would also let her control the narrative to some extent. She'd be able to explain, to contextualize, to minimize. She'd probably claim the recording was old, that she'd changed, that she'd been protecting the family from a difficult truth. She was a master manipulator, and given time to prepare, she might be able to salvage her reputation even in the face of damning evidence. Instead, I wanted to use Patricia's own tactics against her. I wanted to present the evidence in a way that would make it impossible for her to spin, impossible for the family to dismiss, impossible for anyone to claim there was another side to the story. I wanted to honor Mom's memory by finally giving her the voice she'd been denied for so long. "Dad," I said, "I think we should wait. I think we should let Patricia make the first move. Let her continue to believe that she has all the power, that she can say whatever she wants about Mom and me without consequences. And then when she pushes too far, when she says something so awful that even her supporters can't defend her, that's when we play the recording." Dad looked skeptical. He wanted immediate justice, immediate vindication for his wife's memory. But I convinced him that patience would be more effective than outrage. Patricia's cruelty was predictable. Given enough rope, she'd hang herself with it. And when she did, we'd be ready. Over the next few weeks, I watched the family dynamics with new eyes. Patricia held court at family gatherings like she always had, dispensing wisdom about mental health awareness and the importance of supporting struggling family members. She spoke about Mom with the same condescending pity she'd always used, painting herself as the long-suffering sister-in-law who'd tried so hard to help poor Rebecca, but had been limited by the complexity of mental illness. The other family members continued to defer to Patricia's expertise on all things related to Mom's condition. They spoke about Mom's struggles with the kind of informed compassion that comes from being educated by someone who seemed to understand the situation better than anyone else. They had no idea they were parroting the talking points of someone who had orchestrated the very struggles they were discussing. Meanwhile, Patricia continued to treat me like I was a ticking time bomb of inherited mental illness. She watched me carefully at family events, ready to interpret any emotion or opinion as evidence that I was following in Mom's footsteps. When I was quiet, she worried I was depressed. When I spoke up, she worried I was becoming agitated. Every interaction was filtered through her expectation that I would eventually crack the way she'd convinced everyone Mom had cracked. The breaking point came 6 weeks after that initial message, at Patricia's annual Easter brunch. It was the kind of elaborate affair she specialized in, designed more to showcase her hosting abilities than to actually bring the family together. I'd been reluctant to attend, but Dad had convinced me that we needed to maintain appearances until we were ready to strike. The brunch was everything I'd expected. Patricia playing the gracious hostess, Uncle Robert holding court with stories about his business success, various cousins and relatives making small talk while children ran around the perfectly manicured backyard. It was the kind of family gathering Mom had once been excluded from, the kind of event where her absence was explained as being too much for her to handle. I was helping clear dishes when Patricia cornered me in the kitchen. She'd been drinking wine since before noon, and her usual veneer of concern had slipped into something more honest. More cruel. "You know, Sarah," she said, loading plates into the dishwasher with aggressive efficiency, "I've been watching you today, and I have to say I'm concerned. You seem tense, withdrawn, exactly like your mother used to get before her episodes." I continued clearing glasses without responding, but Patricia wasn't done. "I think it might be time to consider getting you some help. Professional help. Before things get as bad as they did with Rebecca. Because honestly, watching you today, I can see the same patterns emerging, the same instability, the same tendency toward paranoia and isolation. She was trying to bait me, trying to get me to react emotionally so she could point to my response as evidence of my deteriorating mental state. But I stayed calm, continued cleaning, let her dig her own grave with words. I know it's hard to accept, she continued, but mental illness is genetic, and your mother's problems were severe. The way she used to make up stories, imagine threats that weren't there, lash out at people who were trying to help her. I can see those same warning signs in you. Other family members had started gathering in the kitchen, drawn by the serious tone of Patricia's voice. They watched with the same fascinated concern they'd once shown when discussing Mom's condition, ready to witness another mental health crisis in real time. Maybe it's time to consider medication, Patricia said, her voice dripping with false compassion. Something to help you before you start having the kinds of delusions your mother struggled with. Before you start making accusations against people who care about you. That's when I knew it was time. Patricia had just threatened me with the same campaign of discrediting she'd used against Mom. She'd just revealed her playbook to a room full of witnesses. She'd just given me the perfect opening to destroy her completely. I pulled out my phone and opened the audio file I'd saved there weeks earlier. Without saying a word, I connected it to Patricia's Bluetooth speaker system and pressed play. Patricia's own voice filled the kitchen, crystal clear and undeniably hers, admitting to knowing about Robert's assault on Mom, admitting to orchestrating 8 years of psychological warfare, admitting to destroying Mom's credibility to protect a rapist. The silence in that kitchen was absolute. 20 people stood frozen as Patricia's recorded voice laid out her strategy for making Mom seem crazy, for undermining her credibility, for ensuring that no one would ever believe her accusations against Robert. They listened as she admitted that she'd seen Mom as a burden, that she'd valued her marriage more than Mom's safety, that she'd systematically turned the family against Mom to protect her own interests. When the recording ended, the silence stretched on for what felt like an eternity. Then, slowly, all eyes turned to Patricia. Her face had gone completely white, her hands were shaking, and for the first time in my life, I saw fear in her eyes. Real, genuine terror at being exposed for what she really was. That's not, she started, then stopped. Because there was no way to deny it. It was her voice, saying those things, admitting to those. There was no way to claim it was taken out of context or misunderstood. The evidence was overwhelming and undeniable. Uncle Robert had gone even paler than his wife. He knew what this meant. He knew that Patricia's recorded admission would inevitably lead to questions about his own actions, questions he wouldn't be able to deflect or deny. The empire of lies they'd built together was crumbling in real time. Dad stepped forward then, his voice shaking with suppressed rage. "Patricia," he said, "you destroyed my wife. You convinced me she was mentally ill when she was actually the victim of assault. You let me medicate her for trauma you helped create. You let her die thinking she was crazy when she was telling the truth the entire time." The family members who had gathered to witness my supposed breakdown were now witnessing something entirely different. They were seeing the architect of Mom's destruction exposed as a calculating predator who had spent 8 years systematically destroying a rape victim to protect her rapist husband. But Patricia wasn't going down without a fight. Even caught red-handed with her own words as evidence, she tried to maintain control of the narrative. "You don't understand," she said, her voice desperate now. "Rebecca was unstable. She was always unstable. Yes, I said those things, but I was trying to protect the family from her delusions. She wasn't a reliable narrator of her own experiences." That's when I finally spoke, my voice steady and clear in the stunned silence of the kitchen. "No, Patricia, you weren't protecting anyone from Mom's delusions, you were protecting everyone from Mom's truth. And the only reason you've been able to get away with it for so long is because you convinced everyone that victims of assault can't be trusted to tell their own stories." I looked around the room at the faces of family members who had spent years believing Patricia's version of events, who had treated Mom with pitying condescension while unknowingly supporting her abuser. "My mother wasn't crazy," I continued. "She was traumatized. And instead of getting help for that trauma, she was gaslit by the very people who should have protected her. She spent the last years of her life believing she was mentally ill because Patricia convinced all of you that her trauma responses were symptoms of madness. The room erupted then, voices raised in accusation and defense, people demanding explanations, others defending their own complicity in Patricia's campaign against Mom. But through it all, I felt a sense of peace I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Mom's voice had finally been heard. Her truth had finally been validated. And Patricia's reign of terror over our family's narrative was finally over. The aftermath of that Easter brunch was swift and brutal. Within hours, the recording had been shared with every member of our extended family. Cousins I hadn't spoken to in years were calling me, asking if what they'd heard was real, if Patricia had actually admitted to covering up Robert's assault on Mom. The answer was always the same: yes, it was real, and there were 12 pages of transcript to prove it. Patricia tried damage control immediately. She sent a lengthy email to the family explaining that the recording was from a dark period in her life, when she was struggling with her own mental health issues. She claimed she'd said those things out of anger and frustration, that she'd never actually believed Mom was lying about Robert, that she'd been trying to protect the family from a scandal that would have destroyed everyone. But her explanations fell flat against the crystal clarity of her recorded words. Uncle Robert's response was predictable. He hired a lawyer within 24 hours and issued a statement through his attorney claiming that any allegations against him were baseless and motivated by family drama. He portrayed himself as the victim of a vindictive campaign, led by his emotionally unstable niece, who was clearly following in her mother's footsteps. But the damage was already done. 3 of his hardware stores had already received calls from concerned customers who had heard about the recording through the family grapevine. The family split into factions almost immediately. There were those who believed the recording and were horrified by what they'd learned about Patricia's role in Mom's suffering. There were others who remained loyal to Patricia, claiming that one recorded conversation couldn't erase years of mental health struggles they'd witnessed firsthand. And there were those who simply wanted the whole thing to go away, who blamed me for destroying family unity by airing dirty laundry that should have stayed buried. My cousin Jake, who had responded to Patricia's cruel message with "finally someone said it," was among the first to reach out with an apology. He called me crying, saying he'd had no idea about the real circumstances behind Mom's struggles, that he'd been manipulated into believing she was unstable just like everyone else. His remorse seemed genuine, but it was hard to forgive years of casual cruelty, even when it was based on lies. The most surprising response came from my cousin Emily, Patricia's own daughter. She called me a week after the brunch, her voice shaking with a mixture of anger and grief. She'd always defended her mother's version of events, had been one of Patricia's most vocal supporters when it came to managing Mom's condition. Now she was questioning everything she'd been told about her own family history. "Sarah," she said, "there are things about my father that I've always wondered about. Things that happened when I was younger that my mother explained away as misunderstandings or accidents. But listening to that recording, hearing how she protected him from Mom's accusations, it's making me remember things differently." Emily's revelation opened a floodgate of family secrets that had been buried under Patricia's careful management for decades. Other female relatives started sharing their own uncomfortable experiences with Robert, incidents they'd dismissed at the time, because Patricia had assured them they were misinterpreting his behavior. The pattern of predatory conduct that Mom had tried to expose was far more extensive than anyone had realized. Within a month, 3 women had come forward with their own stories about Robert's inappropriate behavior. All of them had been young when it happened. All of them had been told by Patricia that they were overreacting or misunderstanding innocent gestures. All of them had spent years doubting their own perceptions because the family matriarch had convinced them they couldn't trust their own experiences. The legal implications became serious quickly. Robert's lawyer couldn't dismiss multiple corroborating accounts from different time periods, especially when there was recorded evidence of Patricia's systematic cover-up operation. 2 of the women decided to press charges despite the statute of limitations challenges. The local prosecutor's office began investigating whether Patricia could be charged as an accessory for her role in concealing Robert's crimes. Patricia's carefully constructed world began crumbling piece by piece. Her position as the family's unofficial leader evaporated overnight as people realized how thoroughly she'd manipulated their perceptions. The Mental Health Awareness Foundation she'd started in Mom's memory was dissolved when board members learned about her actual role in Mom's psychological destruction. Even her closest friends started distancing themselves once they understood the implications of the recording. But the most devastating blow came from an unexpected source. Dad had been quietly investigating Mom's medical records from her various hospitalizations and therapy sessions. What he discovered made Patricia's crimes even more heinous than we'd originally understood. Mom had actually told multiple healthcare providers about Robert's assault over the years. She'd tried repeatedly to get professional help for trauma-related symptoms. But Patricia had been there too, accompanying Mom to appointments as her supportive sister-in-law, providing context about Mom's mental health history to doctors and therapists. She'd systematically undermined Mom's credibility with healthcare providers, convincing them that Mom's trauma memories were actually paranoid delusions, symptomatic of her mental illness. She'd literally prevented Mom from getting appropriate treatment for her assault by convincing medical professionals that she was delusional. The medical records Dad uncovered showed a clear pattern of Patricia's interference. Notes from therapy sessions mentioned that the patient's sister-in-law had concerns about the reliability of trauma memories. Psychiatric evaluations included observations that family members reported the patient had a history of making false accusations. Medication decisions were influenced by Patricia's reports of behavioral changes that matched her descriptions of mental health deterioration. Patricia hadn't just gaslit our family about Mom's condition. She'd gaslit the entire mental health care system, using her position as a concerned relative to ensure that Mom never received proper treatment for trauma. She'd weaponized the mental health profession itself against Mom, turning what should have been a source of healing into another tool of oppression. The revelation about Patricia's interference with Mom's medical care sparked outrage among the healthcare providers who had treated her. Several doctors and therapists came forward to express their horror at being manipulated into participating in Mom's psychological destruction. The hospital where Mom had been treated twice launched an internal investigation into how family members were allowed to influence patient care without proper safeguards. Meanwhile, the recording continued to spread beyond our immediate family. Someone had shared it on social media, and it quickly went viral as an example of how family members can systematically gaslight abuse victims. Mental health advocates began using Mom's story as a case study in how trauma can be misdiagnosed when perpetrators control the narrative around victims' behavior. The attention was overwhelming and painful, but it also served a purpose. Hundreds of people reached out to share their own experiences of being discredited by family members after reporting abuse. Support groups formed around the recognition that Mom's story wasn't unique, that many families contain architects of denial who will sacrifice victims to protect perpetrators. Patricia tried several times to contact me directly, but I refused all communication. She sent letters claiming she wanted to explain her actions, to make amends somehow, to find a way to heal the family divisions her exposure had created.
But there was nothing she could say that would undo 8 years of psychological warfare against my mother. There was no explanation that could justify convincing a rape victim that she was mentally ill. The criminal case against Robert moved slowly through the legal system, but the civil consequences were immediate and severe. His business reputation was destroyed completely once the recording became public knowledge. All 3 hardware stores closed within 6 months as customers boycotted and suppliers terminated contracts. His decades of community standing evaporated overnight when people learned about his history of predatory behavior. Patricia faced her own legal challenges as the investigation expanded. Prosecutors were exploring charges related to witness tampering and conspiracy to conceal crimes. While the statute of limitations complicated direct charges related to Robert's assault, Patricia's ongoing interference with Mom's medical care and her systematic campaign to discredit a crime victim opened new avenues for prosecution. The family gatherings stopped completely. The elaborate holiday celebrations Patricia had orchestrated for decades became impossible when half the family refused to be in the same room with her. The extended family network that had revolved around her leadership fractured into smaller groups of people trying to process the magnitude of her deception.
Dad struggled the most with the revelations about his own unwitting complicity in Mom's suffering. He'd spent months in therapy trying to understand how he'd failed to recognize the signs of trauma versus mental illness, how he'd been manipulated into medicating his wife for symptoms that were actually normal responses to abuse and gaslighting. The guilt was eating him alive, but slowly he was learning to direct his anger toward the people who had actually orchestrated Mom's destruction rather than toward himself. 6 months after the Easter brunch confrontation, I received an unexpected visitor at my apartment in Portland. It was Uncle Robert himself, looking haggard and desperate. He'd somehow gotten my address and had driven 2 hours to see me without warning. When I opened the door and saw him standing there, my first instinct was to call the police. But something about his demeanor made me hesitate. "Sarah," he said, his voice barely above a whisper, "I need to tell you something about your mother. Something that might help you understand what really happened." Against my better judgment, I let him in. He sat heavily on my couch, looking like a man who had aged a decade in 6 months. His business was gone, his marriage was falling apart, and his reputation was destroyed. But more than that, he looked like someone carrying a burden that had finally become too heavy to bear. "Your mother," he began. "She wasn't the only one Patricia silenced over the years. There were others, and there were things she did. Things she orchestrated that went far beyond just covering up what I did to Rebecca." What Robert told me that afternoon added layers of horror to Patricia's crimes that I hadn't imagined possible. She hadn't just been protecting a rapist husband. She'd been systematically identifying and silencing anyone who threatened her carefully constructed version of family reality. Mom had been her most sustained victim, but there had been others over the years. Robert revealed that Patricia had used similar tactics against his own sister when she'd tried to report financial abuse by their father. She'd convinced the family that the sister was having a mental breakdown, had her briefly committed, and had successfully discredited her allegations of embezzlement that would have exposed significant family financial crimes. The sister had eventually moved across the country and cut all ties with the family, leaving Patricia's version of events as the only narrative anyone remembered. He told me about a cousin who had tried to report that Patricia's own father had molested her as a child. Patricia had orchestrated a campaign to paint the cousin as vindictive and attention-seeking, had convinced other family members that the girl was making up stories to get back at the family for some perceived slight. The cousin had eventually recanted her allegations under pressure and had lived with the trauma in silence ever since. Patricia's pattern was always the same: identify the threat to family reputation, systematically undermine the credibility of the person making accusations, rally other family members around the narrative that the accuser was mentally unstable or vindictive, and maintain that narrative until the accuser either recanted or was completely isolated from family support. "She's a master manipulator," Robert said, his voice hollow with defeated recognition. "And I was her perfect weapon because I gave her real crimes to cover up. Every time I crossed a line with someone, she used it as an opportunity to perfect her techniques for discrediting victims. Your mother was just her most successful long-term project." Robert's revelations about Patricia's broader pattern of victim silencing added new dimensions to the criminal investigation. Other family members who had been discredited and isolated over the years began coming forward with their own stories. The scope of Patricia's psychological warfare campaigns stretched back decades and involved dozens of victims across multiple generations. But Robert's most shocking revelation came at the end of our conversation. He told me that Patricia had recorded many of her manipulation sessions with family members over the years. She'd kept detailed audio logs of her gaslighting campaigns, apparently as some twisted form of insurance policy, or perhaps simply because she enjoyed documenting her psychological victories over her victims. "She has recordings of herself convincing your mother she was crazy," Robert said. "Hours and hours of conversations where she systematically breaks down Rebecca's confidence in her own perceptions. She kept them like trophies, Sarah. She was proud of what she'd done to your mother." The thought of Patricia collecting audio evidence of her own psychological torture campaign was almost too horrific to process. But it also represented a potential treasure trove of evidence for prosecutors building cases against her. Robert agreed to help authorities locate and retrieve these recordings in exchange for cooperation credit in his own prosecution. The discovery of Patricia's extensive audio archives marked the beginning of the end of her ability to control any narrative about her actions. Dozens of recordings documented her systematic campaigns against multiple victims across decades. The evidence was so overwhelming that her lawyer eventually advised her to accept a plea deal rather than face trial with such damning documentation of her crimes. As I sit here now, almost a year after that Easter brunch confrontation, I'm still processing the magnitude of what Patricia did to my mother and so many others. The woman I'd known as the family matriarch, the mental health advocate, the compassionate sister-in-law who'd tried so hard to help poor Rebecca through her struggles, was actually a calculating predator who had spent decades perfecting techniques for psychological destruction. Mom never got to see Patricia's downfall, never got to witness the exposure of the lies that had defined the last years of her life. But in a way she'd ensured her own vindication by having the foresight to record that conversation all those years ago. Even in death, her voice had finally been heard. Her truth had finally been validated, and her memory had finally been cleared of the false narrative Patricia had constructed around her suffering. The recording that had hidden in Mom's jewelry box for 8 years had done more than expose one woman's lies. It had revealed an entire system of family abuse designed to protect perpetrators by destroying victims. And in doing so, it had given dozens of other silenced voices the courage to speak their own truths, knowing that this time, someone would believe them. Today marks exactly 18 months since I played that recording at Patricia's Easter brunch. The criminal trials concluded last month, and the sentences were everything I could have hoped for. Robert received 12 years for multiple counts of sexual assault, with additional time for conspiracy to obstruct justice. Patricia was sentenced to 8 years for witness tampering, conspiracy, and what the judge called one of the most systematic and prolonged campaigns of psychological abuse he'd ever encountered in his courtroom. The judge's words during Patricia's sentencing hearing will stay with me forever. He said that Patricia's crimes were particularly heinous because she had weaponized mental health care itself against her victims, turning institutions meant to heal trauma into tools of further abuse. He noted that her actions had not only harmed direct victims, but had undermined public trust in mental health treatment for abuse survivors. The civil lawsuits that followed the criminal convictions provided some measure of financial justice for Mom's suffering. The hospital system where she'd been treated paid a substantial settlement for failing to recognize Patricia's interference with patient care. The therapy practice that had misdiagnosed Mom's trauma as mental illness implemented new protocols to prevent family manipulation of treatment decisions. But beyond the legal victories, the most meaningful change has been in how our remaining family members understand and discuss mental health. The relatives who had unknowingly participated in Patricia's gaslighting campaigns have educated themselves about trauma responses and victim advocacy. They've learned to recognize the difference between supporting someone through genuine mental health struggles and enabling someone's campaign to discredit abuse victims. My cousin Emily, who had initially defended her mother's actions, became one of the most vocal advocates for the other victims who came forward. She used her inheritance from Robert's liquidated businesses to establish a foundation providing legal support for family abuse survivors, whose credibility has been systematically undermined. The foundation specifically focuses on cases where perpetrators use mental health stigma to silence their victims. Dad has transformed his guilt into action, becoming a speaker for organizations that educate healthcare providers about recognizing family manipulation in trauma cases. His presentations include audio clips from Mom's medical consultations where Patricia can be heard subtly undermining Mom's credibility with doctors. Healthcare professionals who hear these recordings learn to identify the warning signs of this type of systematic patient sabotage. The most unexpected development came 6 months ago when I received a letter from a woman named Margaret who lived 3 states away. She had heard about Mom's case through news coverage of Patricia's trial and reached out because she recognized the pattern of psychological warfare from her own family experience. Her mother-in-law had used nearly identical tactics to discredit Margaret after she reported domestic violence, convincing the entire family that Margaret was mentally unstable and prone to making false accusations. Margaret's letter led to connections with dozens of other survivors whose stories followed the same devastating blueprint. Families across the country contained architects of denial who had perfected techniques for protecting abusers by destroying victims' credibility. The tactics were remarkably consistent: document every emotional response as evidence of instability, recruit other family members to express concern about the victim's mental state, interfere with professional treatment to prevent proper trauma diagnosis, and maintain these narratives so consistently that victims eventually doubt their own experiences. These connections led to the formation of a support network for survivors of what we've termed familial gaslighting campaigns. The group provides resources for people trying to escape family systems that have branded them as unreliable narrators of their own experiences. Members share strategies for documenting abuse, protecting their credibility, and rebuilding relationships with family members who have been manipulated into dismissing their experiences. One of the most powerful aspects of this network is the validation it provides to people who have spent years believing they might actually be crazy. When survivors hear dozens of nearly identical stories about systematic credibility destruction, they finally understand that their experiences weren't unique failures of perception, but predictable outcomes of deliberate psychological campaigns. The recording that started all of this has become a teaching tool used by victim advocates, mental health professionals, and legal experts studying family manipulation tactics. Universities include Mom's Case in coursework about recognizing and addressing systematic victim discrediting. Police departments use excerpts from Patricia's confession to train officers on identifying when mental health concerns might actually be evidence of ongoing psychological abuse. But the most personal vindication came last month when I finally felt strong enough to visit Mom's grave for the first time since her funeral. I brought a printed copy of Patricia's conviction records and the news articles about the expanded investigation that had led to justice for multiple victims. I read them aloud to her headstone, telling her that her voice had finally been heard, that her truth had finally been validated, that her courage in making that original recording had saved other people from the same psychological destruction she'd endured. Standing there in the quiet cemetery, I could almost hear Mom's response. She would have been heartbroken to learn about the other victims Patricia had silenced over the years, but she would have been proud that her story had given them the courage to speak up. She would have been amazed that the recording she'd made in desperation had become a catalyst for systemic changes in how families and institutions respond to abuse allegations. The financial settlements from the civil cases allowed me to take early retirement from the library and dedicate myself full-time to advocacy work. I spend my days supporting other survivors of familial gaslighting campaigns, helping them document their experiences, connecting them with legal resources, and most importantly, convincing them that their perceptions are valid even when their entire family insists otherwise. The work is emotionally challenging but deeply meaningful. Last week, I helped a young woman whose family had convinced her she was having paranoid delusions about her stepfather's sexual abuse. Her grandmother had orchestrated a campaign nearly identical to Patricia's, recruiting extended family members to express concern about the girl's mental health while systematically preventing her from accessing appropriate trauma treatment. The family had even had her briefly hospitalized for psychiatric evaluation when she refused to recant her allegations. Using strategies developed from Mom's Case, we were able to document the grandmother's manipulation tactics and present evidence to both law enforcement and mental health professionals. The girl is now receiving proper trauma therapy, her stepfather is facing criminal charges, and her family is beginning to understand how they were manipulated into protecting an abuser by discrediting his victim. These victories feel like honoring Mom's memory in the most direct way possible. Every survivor who escapes a gaslighting campaign, every family that learns to recognize manipulation tactics, every institution that implements safeguards against systematic victim discrediting represents progress that Mom's suffering helped make possible. Patricia tried to reach me one final time last month, sending a letter from prison through her attorney. She wanted to express remorse for her actions and ask for my forgiveness as part of her rehabilitation process. The letter contained all the expected elements: acknowledgement of harm caused, acceptance of responsibility, commitment to making amends. But it was also filled with subtle attempts to minimize her actions and suggest that her motivations had been misunderstood rather than malicious. I didn't respond to the letter. Patricia had spent decades perfecting the art of manipulation, and I had no interest in providing her with another opportunity to practice those skills. Her expressions of remorse rang hollow when measured against 18 months of evidence about the systematic nature of her psychological warfare campaigns. Some actions are too calculated, too sustained, and too destructive to be excused by after-the-fact apologies. Instead, I focused my energy on the positive changes that had emerged from exposing her crimes. The expanded investigation had led to justice for multiple victims across several decades. Healthcare systems had implemented new protocols to prevent family manipulation of patient care. Educational institutions were teaching new generations of professionals to recognize and address systematic victim discrediting. Support networks were providing resources for survivors trying to escape similar family dynamics. Most importantly, other families were learning to question narratives about relatives who were labeled as mentally unstable, especially when those labels seemed to coincide with allegations of abuse or misconduct. The assumption that family members wouldn't systematically destroy someone's credibility was being replaced by awareness that such campaigns were unfortunately common and remarkably effective. As I finish writing this story, I'm preparing for another speaking engagement at a conference about family trauma and mental health misdiagnosis. I'll be presenting Mom's case alongside those of other survivors whose experiences demonstrate the need for institutional safeguards against manipulation by family perpetrators. The audience will include healthcare providers, legal professionals, and victim advocates who are working to ensure that future abuse survivors receive support rather than systematic discrediting. The recording that Patricia thought would never see the light of day has now been heard by thousands of people working to prevent similar psychological campaigns. Mom's voice, which was silenced for so many years, has become a powerful tool for education and advocacy. Her story has helped other victims find their own voices and has taught professionals to recognize when mental health concerns might actually be evidence of ongoing abuse. Patricia believed she could control the narrative about Mom's life forever, that her version of events would become the only truth anyone remembered. She underestimated the power of actual evidence and the determination of people who refuse to let victims be forgotten or discredited. She never imagined that the recording she thought was safely hidden would become the key to exposing decades of systematic abuse and manipulation. The message Patricia sent me that night 18 months ago was meant to silence me the same way she'd silenced Mom. "You're just like your crazy mother. Maybe you should have gone with her." But instead of crushing me, those words gave me the clarity I needed to finally use the weapon Mom had left me. Patricia's cruelty became the catalyst for her own destruction, the final push that convinced me to honor Mom's memory by making sure her voice was finally heard. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.